Esther. How are you today?
I am doing awesome. So glad to be with you today, Heather.
Yes, we're so excited to have you here on the podcast. And I love that we're going to be focusing about really being able to know what to do if you actually created a business that you don't necessarily love, and really how to navigate that process to
Yeah.
make sure that you've got a business model that makes sense. But Esther, before we kind of go into that, I like to ask just kind of this question off at the top, because I love how God just kind of has a lot of us on these journeys where we end up in places that we maybe didn't even see coming. So, share with our audience, what were you doing 10 years ago in life?
10 years ago. Oh my goodness. Okay. So at that time, my daughter was 2 years old. I believe I was still working part time. So my background and my training is in social work. So my husband is a pastor. At that time, he was a youth pastor, and I had a 2 year old little girl. I was also working part time. And then I was on the side hustling to try and grow a direct sales business. So that's what I was doing 10 years ago. Very different from what life looks like now.
Okay, I love it. And I love the snapshot, because the reality is sometimes we end up doing things, or we end up having businesses that wasn't necessarily even on our mind. And
Right.
so as we kind of fast forward to this topic, the reason I wanted to really be able to elevate part of your story and get you to share that on today's episode is I know that there are so many people that are maybe chasing a financial goal, and they sometimes are not giving themselves the freedom in that process of really trying to say, do I like what I'm about to actually create? And what
Yeah.
ultimately does that look like? And then maybe thinking about it almost strategically from a different way. So, would you mind just sharing with us a little bit about your own experience of having created something and then said, wait, what is this that I've created? And then kind of how you ultimately turn that around.
Yeah, sure. So I actually have kind of two times where I specifically remember feeling that way. And the first time is probably about a year, maybe 6 months after I started as a service provider. So I had started in January of 2017, started offering a service provider type business. So I really started out as a virtual assistant. And at the time, it was a real financial need. I had quit the network marketing business that I had been doing for 10 years because I was completely burnt out from that. And I had been pursuing blogging and writing, which I love, and it's still one of my passions, but that wasn't making very much money at the time. So I realized I had to do something, and I had the skills to be a virtual assistant. So I jumped right into that, and I dove headfirst into getting clients. And within about 6 months to a year, I realized, oh my goodness, like this is crazy. I am working all the time. I have no time freedom. So, yes, I was hitting my financial goals,
Mm.
but what it looked like for me and for my family was not what I wanted it to look like. I was working way more than I wanted to be working. I didn't have the flexibility and time freedom, so my business really wasn't lining up with where I felt God wanted me to be in terms of my values and my goals. And so I kind of shifted at that point to starting to be a little bit more specific about who I wanted to work with and the type of work I wanted to do. So I kind of up leveled the type of work I was doing, and I got into serving people who had podcasts. And so I ended up going down the road of really niching down into podcasting and started doing podcast management and podcast launching and helping people, with all things podcasting. So I love podcast. I launched my own podcast, and I ended up just that was my world. And so about 6 months after really getting into the podcasting world, I started to realize I was getting more and more clients that needed these services. And so I basically ended up starting to build an agency business because I had more work than I could do on my own. I couldn't do the editing, or I didn't want to do all the editing myself. And there were a lot of pieces of the podcast management stuff that I didn't really want to continue doing myself. And so I hired a team. I got people on board to help with all these different pieces. And I had some mentors and or people that I kind of followed who were like, this is it. You can do this. You can create this amazing massive business as a podcast management agency, and you could basically work your way out of the day-to-day work, which is true. I was able to do that to some extent. But once again, about a year after I had shifted into that role, I was like, wait a minute, this isn't actually what I want to be doing. Like, yes, I love podcasts. I love helping people with podcasts, but that's not really where my passion lies. And I also was starting to get clients that I didn't really align with their values and kind of what they were sharing. And
Mm.
so it became a point where I had to make a decision on whether I was going to continue down that road of that business model or if I was going to shift into something totally different.
Okay, so here are a couple things that come up as you were talking. The first part, when you kind of were sharing that story of, I kind of went down this route of becoming like a virtual assistant and taking on different clients. What I heard you say, which I think is a great point for our audience listening, is be willing to shift. And for
Yeah.
sometimes that can be scary. Sometimes that might look a little bit more like a pivot. For some of us, it might look like a complete 180. But I think just kind of like a life lesson from your own personal journey is that when you are willing to say, I'm going to try this and I'm going to shift this, it ultimately made that change easier for you.
Yeah.
And I also heard you say that you narrowed your niche. Even once you started saying, I'm doing this and I'm starting to get into helping people with podcasts, and it kind of
Yeah.
ultimately even opened up that second avenue. But here's a question I have for you. Of what you've shared for us in the last few minutes, do you think that it was a matter of sometimes you don't know if you're going to like it until you get in there? And it was that, and you're like, wow, I basically kept saying yes to these opportunities. And now that I'm looking at what this looks like, I don't like this. Or do you think it was a matter of I'm doing this, but I feel like I'm bored, or I feel like this isn't my calling, or this isn't what I'm passionate about, even though it might meet a lot of the other things that you would want out of a business? Is it financially generating income? Those types of things.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's so good. It's such a good question. I think that it was a combination of both because I am a big believer that you have to be willing to try a lot of things to figure out what you actually should be doing, to find that sweet spot, to find where you want to be in the long run. I don't think there's any way back 5 or 6 years ago when I was starting this whole journey that I could have figured out where I'm going to be now. I couldn't have predicted that, even if I had sat and prayed and reflected and done a lot of that. At the same time, I do think I should have done 2 things differently. One, I should have spent a little bit more time at the very beginning considering what I wanted my ideal life to look like before diving into the whole world of becoming a virtual assistant and serving my clients. Because I think if I had done that, I could have done a little bit more with setting better boundaries and creating a little bit more of a structure for the type of business that I wanted versus just serving everybody, doing everything, taking on every single client that came my way. So I wish I would have created a little bit more clarity around my ideal life. And then when I got into starting that agency with the podcast management, I had a gut feeling that agency wasn't the way to go for me. I kind of just knew it because I am a real strong introvert, and managing a large team and having tons of clients was not actually didn't feel appealing to me.
Right.
But on the outside, it looked like it made sense for where I was at in that business journey. But I wish I would have just trusted my gut and said, "Okay, wait a minute. Maybe there's a different path I can take here. Maybe I can step into a different model and transition my business, sooner than I actually did." If I had trusted my gut on that, I probably would have been able to avoid some of the stress that I incurred because I was doing something that I didn't really love.
So, how would you say when you were at that space of doing more so the podcast agency route, or you were kind of heading in that path versus right now, what you're doing spring of 2021 and what your path is now on that
Yeah.
business model? How would you say, like, what I'd say strategic questions have you maybe asked yourself, or how did you actually kind of get on the path of where you are right now?
Yeah, that's such a good question. I really had to do some hard hard questions, and essentially I remember one moment in my kitchen thinking, "Oh my goodness, like what if nothing I had created existed. Like nothing of my current business existed. And what if I just started from scratch? What would I want that to look like? So that was one of the questions I asked myself, was really, what do I want my business to look like? If I could do anything, what would I be doing? And I really encourage people to think about that and not feel trapped in what you feel like you have to be doing, you know?
Right.
So that's one thing, is really, and along with what do I want my life to look like? So that's another big question, is what do I want my life to look like? And then what do I want my ideal business to look like? And even if you can't do that right now, and I couldn't just automatically switch into that mode because I had created this agency, I couldn't just quit everything I was doing, or I didn't want to do that, it had to be a gradual plan. So those were a couple questions, what do I want my business to look like? I think I also really had to go back to, what do I feel God has called me to? What has God gifted me in? What are those natural, innate gifts, both natural gifts and spiritual gifts, that He has equipped me with? And how could I actually use them to make the biggest impact? Not just the impact that makes sense to other people, but the impact that makes sense and aligns with where God has called me. And that meant leaning into those things instead of doing maybe what I thought I was supposed to be doing. So I don't know if that makes sense, but it was a lot of really considering, and reflecting on where I'm at and where God has called me to be, and looking for the path that would get me to that point.
I love that, Esther. And I mean, when I hear you say that, I think even a little bit of my own journey. And I feel as Christians, when we're willing to pause and when we're willing to reflect upon, like, is this what God is calling for me? Or man, or this opportunity seems really scary, or even outside of my own comfort zone, but this keeps coming up. Is God trying to show me something? Or I just think that it's courageous to be willing, as a CEO and as business leaders with kingdom minded hearts, that I think that it's courageous to slow down and say, this is good. All of these things in front of me are good. All of these options look good. Or I'm even talented, and I feel like I've got different gifts on these different opportunities that are before me. But which of these right now at this time, do I feel that God is guiding me towards? Or there are confirmations or different things that are coming up to just to validate that this is the path that God wants me to choose. So I love that you shared that.
Yeah. Yeah. I think there's so many times that we have our plans in our own minds of
Mhm.
what we think we're supposed to do. And that even happened for me at the end of 2020, because as you know, I have a leadership podcast and a business podcast. And I kind of, for a long time, have had these two separate audiences that I was trying to serve. I
Mm.
was trying to show up and create things for both of them. And at the end of 2020, I had this big plan for 2021 of creating this whole new program for the leadership women, and then a whole system and courses and programs for the business audience. And God just sort of stopped me in my tracks and was like, no, you can't keep trying to do all of it. And I wanted to just do everything, but He redirected me and said, you know what? The business women is where you can make the biggest impact. And that's who you need to serve right now. And I still am doing the leadership podcast. That's still a passion of mine. But I stopped trying to come up with a way to, create programs or courses or ways to work with both of those audiences, because it just wasn't the direction that God was leading me.
Awesome. I love that you've just shared part of your story and shared part of your heart and just kind of the journey that God has you on in business. And Esther, I think that, what success means, or what that even looks like to all of us, whether we're women, whether we're men listening, it's not the exact same thing. And so I think that is so important when we're trying to say, what does success look like? What does this business I want to create? And what do I want my life to look like? Because I know for me, one of my greatest things, it's not necessarily a monetary reflection, but my time freedom is so precious to me. And so when I'm like, what do I want to do? What offerings do I want? I ultimately am like, how does this work? Having one teenager and two middle schoolers. What does that look like to be a wife and a mom and a business owner, and doing it in a way that allows me to honor God, but allows me to honor this season of motherhood for my family. And that's not the same for all of us, no matter if we're the exact same age. So I love that if we take more time at the beginning to be a little more reflective, it can even make just the business journey smoother and even easier.
Yeah, for sure.
So Esther, I want people to be able to come and connect with you, who maybe enjoyed, or maybe they didn't know about you or how they could connect. So tell everyone where you like to hang out on social media and where they can come to learn more about you and your services.
Okay, awesome. So primarily I hang out on Facebook and Instagram. Those are probably my two favorite places. On Facebook, you can find me at Esther Littlefield. I have a page, and then I have a couple groups. One is for business women and one is more for the leadership side. And on Instagram, it's just Esther D Littlefield. Couldn't get the one without my middle initial on there. And then you can also just go to my website, estherlittlefield.com. And I do have a free guide there. It's the Ideal Life and Biz Guide. So if you want a little bit more of what we talked about today in terms of questions to ask yourself and to work through figuring out maybe where you want to be, in the next year or two, then you could grab that free guide right there on my website.
Awesome. Very cool. And guys, if you want to get all the socials or her website, we've got all that for you on our show notes for today. So you can also just head to sweetteasocialmarketing.com/episode 203, making it as easy as possible for you to be able to get in touch with Esther. So Esther, we love to wrap up every single episode with our quick and easy rapid fire questions. It doesn't hurt. And you just say the very first thing that comes to your mind. Are you ready?
I'm trying to be ready. Yes.
Okay. Beach or mountains?
Beach.
London or Vancouver?
Ooh, Vancouver.
Favorite productivity tool?
Trello.
One person that you would tell thank you to help you get to where you are in your business over the last 5 years?
Natalie Gingrich.
Okay. And then the last and final question, tell us one thing, Esther, you love to do when you are not working.
Okay. I love to go out and hike. Go anywhere on an adventure, hiking outdoors.
That's so cool. I love it. Thank you so much for being here with us today, Esther. And I hope that everyone listening today has enjoyed it. And again, continue to go out there, lean into what God is just calling you to do, and just take time to be reflective. And I think that today's conversation with you, Esther, has really served a really great need. So I really appreciate you being here.
Thank you, Heather.
Thanks so much, guys. Take care.